All right, it's the top of the hour, so I think we'll get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's BI Energy Exchange, where we talk about our research and developing topics in energy markets. Today we've got a very special discussion about hydrogen, and we're joined by Ismail Hammami from Pickering Energy Partners. And I would just like to say that going around the world today, we've got a very diverse group here. So we've got Salih Yilmaz in Dubai. I'm sitting in Zurich. I'm here for a meeting. We've got Hares and Patricio Alvarez in London. We've got Fernando Valle in New York. And Ish is also joined by his colleague Jacob in Houston. So we're going to have a great discussion, all things hydrogen. And so hydrogen is, in my mind, one of the hype fuels of the moment. It is getting a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, and given the current state of play, I would be curious to start with just how big of a fuel or technology, however you want to describe it, do you think it's going to play in the energy mix over the coming decade plus? Ish, this is for you. You're our guest.
I'm happy to start. So, Ismail Hammami, I'm a partner leading the strategic consulting group at Pickering Energy Partners. So I think, one, Rob, thanks for having us on. I think hydrogen is poised at that inflection point, right, where it's been a known commodity for decades and decades, right? And it's been the golden thing that's like everyone's dreamt about, right? It only has water as a byproduct, a clean fuel, right? But there's all the things of just physics that have kept it from growing to what it needs to be. And I think the energy transition, I think post 2020-21 has given it birth probably in a way that people didn't think it was going to happen, right? It's supported by all the majors. So the Exxons, the Shells, BPs, Chevrons, everyone's got hydrogen teams out there. They're pushing behind it. There's been legislation behind it that's coming. So I think in my view, right, it's been a commodity that's been around. It's at significant scale today. It already has a significant impact globally, especially in the refining value chain and a couple other industries as well. And so I think it's poised to grow from here. And I think there's a lot of new demand applications that are going to be the things that really spur the growth of it. Okay. And maybe let me open that up to discussion or thoughts from others on the call, because there's a lot to talk about. But I think I certainly echo the feelings that we're at that inflection point. There's a ton of movement. If you just look at projects that are happening specifically along the Gulf Coast, there's pockets in Australia and in Chile, and things are moving quick.
Yeah, I mean, Ish, just today we got an announcement from Chevron, LyondellBasell, Air Products that they are developing a new project for green hydrogen, ammonia, and the green hydrogen, interestingly enough, made out of natural gas, but with carbon capture attached to it. So it seems like the incentives given on the Inflation Reduction Act have spurred a lot more movement, and it's still in exploratory phases, as you said. It's incipient, but it certainly sparked a lot of interest among the oil and gas players, but also the industrial gas sector.
Hares, do you want to comment on how the European energy majors are thinking of hydrogen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the strategies for hydrogen among the European majors are definitely firming up. We're seeing green hydrogen as a clear favorite over the blue. This is not that surprising given the ambitious renewable power targets that have sort of represented the keystone of these energy transition strategies. But yeah, I think we see in-market development and scaling of the hydrogen economy to really pick up pace probably next decade. And for these European majors, hydrogen is probably ultimately going to represent a marginal but still meaningful vector for their emissions reduction. And just a couple of key projects. So we've got Shell and Equinor that are jointly developing the largest project in Europe, which is North H2. This is targeting 4 gigawatts by 2030, 10 gigawatts by 2040. And so between the green and the blue, we think they obviously have a complementary role to play, but blue looks increasingly likely to represent a sort of interim decarbonization vector for these companies. We're also seeing some sort of differentiation of hydrogen strategies. For instance, Total, their strategy looks quite different in that they're looking mostly to displace their gray hydrogen consumption at their existing refineries rather than build out a big green hydrogen business over the long term.
I want to come back to you with a question kind of following up from both Fernando and Will, because you kind of put it to the group about, which sectors, because I think hydrogen could have a lot of applications. Which ones do you think are most promising? I'm particularly struck by a company like NextEra, where they talk about hitting what they describe as real zero instead of net zero, and part of their plan to get to being fully carbon free is to run hydrogen through CCGTs, I think, to basically get through the winter and things like that with hydrogen. Is that realistic, or are there other sectors that you think are going to be much more prominent in the near term?
Yeah, and so you'll hear, I guess, as you hear kind of me and Jacob say things, we're going to always go back to some type of constructs or models. And so here's Philosoph. I was kind of going through NextEra's investor presentation yesterday, right? And they have definitely, I think, pivoted in a big way to putting hydrogen very prominently in their materials. I think they're not one to be taken lightly, and I think they'll have a leading position. They've been an incredible utility that I think anyone who's been following them has been super impressed. But maybe to get back to answer your question, along demand cases, right? I think for light mobility, I think that one's written off. There's some like the Toyotas and a couple other people who have kind of dreamt about that being their solution. I think for the most part, BEVs around the world are the ones that kind of win on light mobility. I think there's some mobility applications where hydrogen is going to be the answer, but I think if we step back and think of it through a construct, we want to kind of think through supply and demand, right? Supply right now is very limited of green hydrogen. There's projects coming, right? 25, 26, 27, but it's really the back half of the decade is where we're going to see projects. And I think Will is basically saying, hey, we're talking about things in gigawatts now, right? So we went from megawatt projects to gigawatts. So things are going to happen at scale. It's going to be very similar to what we saw in unconventionals in the U.S., right? We were talking in like tens of thousands of barrels to hundreds of thousands to millions, right? Just the size and scale. And we made a huge impact in the U.S. from a lower 48 perspective. I think we'll see the same thing in hydrogen, right? With the U.S. Gulf Coast, I think, playing a large part. But it's going to be limited, right? I think demand, there's going to be good, big demand sinks, I think, around the world, right? And there's one geographically, I think, Europe and Asia, but really driven by kind of Japan and some of the other countries in Asia, are going to be big demand sinks. But then it's like, what are the best uses, okay? So forgetting like where you can actually sell, but maybe where we should be allocating it to is to the hardest to decarbonize areas where economically it makes the most sense. So the IRA is kind of getting to that. I think the IRA is going to help spur and grow, I think, the size of the hydrogen industry in a very meaningful way, right? Because it's basically giving a price signal. But I think one thing we may see is maybe a misallocation of who uses green hydrogen in the short run. Okay, that's maybe one of the things where it's like doing something that's just a policy support doesn't, I think from a capitalistic perspective, allocate the molecules to the best places.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I'd like to bring on Patricio, who covers the European utilities and gas distribution companies for us. And I know that REPowerEU also places a lot of emphasis on hydrogen. So Patricio, is this something that your companies are really actively pushing in the near term? And I know SNAM has always been talking about doing some of the hydrogen blending in their gas pipeline network. What's the latest state of play on kind of that idea as well?
I think in terms of how the major integrated utilities here in Europe are viewing green hydrogen is they simply put it, it's in all of their materials, it's in all of their strategies. Although for now, at least, like I think echoing what Will said, for now, I think the next decade it will be a focus on deploying more wind and solar, and most of their capital spending plans are being dominated by both renewables and sort of reinforcing and renewing their existing networks. But green hydrogen is playing a role, albeit small from a capex point of view, but still they are involved in in many of the world's largest green hydrogen projects. So you have your Iberdrolas, your RWE, who is a co-investor in Europe's largest green hydrogen project with Equinor and RWE. So we see them sort of going into these different projects, and that is also coherent, I think, with the stage at where demand is. So it seems like now it's going to be mostly sort of ad hoc applications for industrial use, so chemicals and refiners. And our portfolio of utilities are involved, especially in providing the renewable energy for these projects. I think it's a natural fit for utilities, especially for power generators, to be that sort of renewable power. And I think, in a sense, it gives them sort of an edge, perhaps, over oil majors, at least for now, just given the scale of their portfolios. And at the other end, like you mentioned, we have the gas network utilities here in Europe. You have Enagas, Italgas, and Snam that you mentioned, with the latter being, I think, the most aggressive in terms of its plans to sort of migrate from a gas distribution business into a green hydrogen distribution business. And it's still nascent. The REPowerEU plan sort of sets its sights towards next decade in terms of scaling capacity in a meaningful way. But Snam is there. They are still blending gas with hydrogen. They're still sort of in the pilot stage. But again, it's hard to sort of gauge what the potential is, because most of these companies do have a vested interest. Gas distributors want to be able to distribute something through their pipes, and they're still studying. I think the highest blend for a safe sort of transportation of green hydrogen and gas mix is about 20% at the moment, but I think the economics are still not there if you wanted to migrate or sort of swap the pipes to carry green hydrogen at this stage.
Ish, I want to come back to you on that idea, because I think one of the things we discussed in our pre-call was this idea that hydrogen is notoriously difficult to transport. It's corrosive. It's got some difficulties, and we talked about how, perhaps ammonia and methanol and other things like that may emerge as sort of the vector for hydrogen. But how do you see it, and what do you make of this idea of blending hydrogen in the gas network? Is that wasted effort, or do you think we're going to see some of that?
Well, so I think step one is, like, from a hydrogen midstream perspective, the good news is it already happens, right? Like in the U.S., we already have 1,000+ miles of pipe along the Gulf Coast moving hydrogen. And that's really the industrial gas folks. And so that we know is technologically feasible. Can you just take an existing natural gas pipeline and say, oh, we move gas, we're going to do this? Challenging, right? Like, again, you have to have the right metallurgy. And there's a lot of things that you would think are easy to do. Once you get the engineers in there, right, they're like, yep, stupid finance people, this doesn't make any sense. Here's exactly why, right? Which is including like molecules kind of slipping away, any kind of corrosion, et cetera, that you've mentioned. Separate topic, which is actual blending of hydrogen into that gas, right? I think there's things that we really need to think of, right? Which is, especially in the U.S., we have all our long-haul transmission pipes, they're all interconnected. So you have a common commodity, right? And so putting them on long-haul transmission, I think, becomes super difficult, because every single demand contract or like offtake contract has very specific things on heat content or BTU contents for the actual gases in there. And then you have to rewrite all those if you're kind of mixing it in. So I think that doesn't work. From an LDC perspective, for a particular LDC, could one of them do it? Yeah, I think, right, we've already got several people. I think the SoCal gas people in California are talking about it. There's a couple others that are thinking about it, but it's more of an LDC. Is it the best use? I personally think, just pure economics, probably not. Right? I think the best use is going out to heavy industries and getting into things that you have no other option for decarbonizing on.
Salih, I want to come over to you and get some reaction from you as well. I know that Saudi Aramco and SABIC have both been talking about hydrogen for a while. What's the perspective from the Middle East, and where do you think it's going to sit in their focus over the next 5 to 10 years? Is it a North America European story, I guess is my question, or is it going to be a true global story?
For Aramco, it's definitely becoming at least a part of their energy transition story. And for a very long time, we've been discussing, does Aramco actually have an energy transition story? And for a very long time, we've been saying that they're really lagging, especially their European peers. But now we know, now they are telling us more about what they're planning. And it seems hydrogen is going to be a big part of it. And it's not just blue, they're actually planning some green hydrogen projects as well. And I think for them, what it will look like is in the near to midterm, it's a blue hydrogen story, especially on the Gulf region where they already have that's where their facilities are. They already have great hydrogen production, and they have access to natural gas production and kind of existing CCUS assets. But on the Red Sea side, they have also told us that they have a plan for a $5 billion project at the new NEOM site with actually partnership with Air Products. Building an electrolyzer and getting into green hydrogen as well. I think for them, they think they're in a pretty good position to be converting this hydrogen into ammonia and shipping that to Asia and Europe. I think they've done some test shipments to Japan already last year. And this is for Aramco. I mean, this is a listed company now, and it's within our coverage, and they are arguably a lot more transparent than they used to be when they were purely an NOC. But at the same time, we have ADNOC here in the UAE, and even though they're not listed, we know that they want to be a bigger player in the hydrogen economy as well. They have plans for blue hydrogen, and they've done a very similar shipment of blue ammonia to Asia as well. So I think I don't really know if we can call it a global phenomenon yet, but it's definitely not just the US or Europe. It seems that the Middle East, the Middle Eastern companies think that there is potential, and they seem to be starting to divert some capital spending into hydrogen as well.
Will, I want to come back to you. I know one of the items that crossed the wire on the terminal this morning was that Shell had quietly shut down all of its UK hydrogen fueling stations, if I recall correctly reading the article. So what do you make of that? Do they get in too early? I think we've already kind of knocked on the idea that hydrogen is going to play any meaningful role in the light-duty transport. Is it just simply an acknowledgement of that reality, or are there other things at play in your mind?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and Ish suggested the same earlier. I mean, light duty is the application of hydrogen is pretty weak. The industrial processes which require high temperatures and where emissions reduction can't be served by electricity, so like refining, chemicals, steel, aluminum, we think these are some of the most attractive applications for the hydrogen economy. Maybe a little bit on heating and energy storage, perhaps. But yeah, I think it's interesting from an energy transition strategy standpoint. It's not surprising to see some of these big European majors to have their fingers in a lot of different energy transition pots. This is a way for them to de-risk and understand these technologies ahead of time, decades in some circumstances, to be able to ramp and scale if that technology becomes really big. So I'm not that surprised that they have been involved in light duty with hydrogen, and it's also not that surprising that now with hindsight that they're shutting them down.
Fernando, I want to come back to you. One of the ideas that we've often discussed in the context of the energy transition is that it's something that the integrateds are doing. You kind of see how it can fit in their broad set of portfolios, but it's harder for a pure E&P often to have a solid energy transition narrative. Does hydrogen change that in your view, or is this something that's going to sort of stick within the sort of Exxon Chevrons, or do you think some of the other player types will take an interest in this kind of business?
And I'd add the midstream players as potential eventual entrance into the system as well. For pure E&P, it's difficult because you're getting out of the molecule early on and you're selling it onto a refiner or natural gas processor. And so you don't really have control. So with Aramco and Enagas, as Salih was mentioning, they have refineries, they have petrochemical plants, they have uses for hard to decarbonize hydrogen that can be used, and they can make blue hydrogen, even if that's not the end goal in Europe or the US, they can still do that. And we've always talked about how there's this difference between the European majors and US majors, and I think here's the same. Will highlighted how most Europeans, ex-Total, are trying to go towards green hydrogen, and here in the US, especially with this today's announcement from Chevron, just highlights it's a blue going green sort of hydrogen, right? It's renewable natural gas to some part, but it's also natural gas with CCS. I think it just shows another portion of how different their strategies are on the transition at large. That Exxon and Chevron are much more focused on CCS and then hydrogen as a potential capture for another portion of the energy matrix, and not the light vehicles, but energy storage, heating, etc. And then CCS and decarbonizing the existing value chain rather than replacing it with EVs and solar and wind. But I am curious, something that we've talked about, and I wonder myself, is it whether there are any technological breakthroughs that could prompt wider adoption. Clearly, light vehicles is very difficult, but there may be something out there, especially now as we grow development of green hydrogen, that could make it a little bit more easier to adapt.
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Ish, on this.
I'm happy to jump in there. I think on the technology front, I think there's multiple ones that are out there. I'm not going to go into specifics and talk about specific technologies, because I think most of them are kind of years off, and each of them have their pluses and minuses, right? But if you think about categories, a lot of them are focused on electrolyzers, and those are kind of go into like the alkaline and PMs, the solid oxides, or on the fuel cell, right? And those are kind of the two big categories where maybe technology plays a huge play. But then you think about what actually drives down cost, right? So that I think we could have breakthroughs on technology, right? But I think we've been working on hydrogen stuff for a long time. But then it's really the scaling and learning factor. I think this is where we may be getting a lot, right? Again, it goes back to kind of what Will touched on, which is going from megawatts to gigawatts. We've got to develop new, and this is doable, right? We've done this in lower 48 in the US as a proving point. In 10 years, we built out the entire ecosystem, right? Which is developing infrastructure that includes like hydrogen transport and storage, potentially fueling stations for heavy duty, right? CO2 transport and storage for the blue hydrogen, water purification and transportation, because you need a lot of water for the electrolyzers, electricity transmission, right? To the extent you're doing it hydrogen by wires, port infrastructure, right? A mature supply chain, right? That's port infrastructure is like if you're taking the hydrogen and putting it into ammonia or methanol, which we also see as a big demand thing that I didn't touch on earlier. But I think Salih did a great job of explaining from an Aramco perspective of markets that they see, right? I think we agree full-heartedly with him that those are other markets that will, right? You're talking about a gigantic supply chain. And then you think about companies like a Plug Power who are like, we're going to come in, we're going to be the vertically integrated one, right? I potentially, not to say they're going to be wrong on this, right? But I challenge to say this is an incredibly complicated supply chain, much like oil and gas. And the types of capital and the types of projects you need are so diverse, right? So you're going from, on the green side, wind and solar people who take tons of capital, very low returns, right, and have a different skill set, to the electrolyzers, right, where you kind of have, and maybe it's the same people who run the electrolyzers because it's probably not rocket science to do that. Moving hydrogen is a whole different story on midstream, right, and it's very analogous to what we do in kind of gas or crude or NGL markets, right? But then you have to be thinking about have relationships with off-takers overseas. So now you have a whole set of commercial people you have to deal with, right? You have to be thinking about, you're probably going to have relationships on ammonia and methanol, and it gets complicated fast. So I guess my whole point, without me kind of doing a filibuster here for another 10 minutes, is I think it's going to require a lot of specialization over time. I think why you've seen some of the fuel cell and other technology companies move upstream is they want supply, right? And they're telling the market to say, if other people don't give us supply, we're going to do it ourselves because we have to birth the industry. I think that's kind of like how the market will evolve over time.
So I want to follow up, and this can be for everyone, but just the idea of birthing the industry. Do you think that we will move toward or need a transparent pricing benchmark similar to WTI, Henry Hub, or something like that for hydrogen to really sort of help attract interest in the commodity? Or is this for the foreseeable future going to kind of be sort of single contracts, individually negotiated deals, or are we going to see price benchmarks emerge for hydrogen? And what's the price point today in your mind that companies are striving to achieve? Ish, we can go to you first, but I'm sure some of the folks from our team will probably want to weigh in. Fernando.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing Fernando. Is it just me?
No, that's my fault. I was on mute. I think eventually with any commodity, you need to develop a liquid market. I mean, we're seeing that emerge now with LNG, but I think it's something that will develop more naturally as we figure out the supply chain. As Ish was saying, it's a very complicated supply chain, and you'll only have it's kind of a chicken-egg situation, but you only develop a benchmark once you have fungibility between markets. If it's still a very localized market, then you won't necessarily have that benchmark. The Henry Hub it's fungible within the U.S. It's not fungible globally, but you can still price it at very different regions within the U.S. as long as you have movement. Same with Brent globally for oil, because it's a fungible market and you can price off of that. Right now, I think they're still very localized, so you'll be direct contracts, and especially because the main drivers are subsidies still. As we reduce the amount of support from the government, and this stands on its own and becomes more fungible, then I believe the benchmark will be required and developed.
Will, Hares, maybe over to you. How are your companies evaluating the price performance, or the sort of performance of a project if you don't have a transparent price? Are they just trying to hit a sort of specific target and they think there's a market there at a certain price, or kind of how do they think through the economics?
Yes, so disclosure from the European majors on their hydrogen projects has been pretty cagey. As far as targets go, each of their strategies outlines, a gigawatt target for where they want to get to by 2030 or so, and we're also seeing, a heavy sort of de-risking by piecemeal stakes being taken in some of these large projects, particularly focused in Northwestern Europe, which we see as sort of becoming, maybe some of the Americans might disagree, but seeing as sort of like the mecca hydrogen. This is just given the proximity to the North Sea with offshore wind resource, with mature gas reservoirs for CCUS application. So yeah, I mean, from a price point, we're not getting much from these companies right now, but it is very clear that the hydrogen ambitions of the European majors is moving in one direction, and that's up. And it's like BP and Shell, they're looking to control a double-digit percentage of the global hydrogen market by the early 2030s. So it's a serious component. They're serious about their investment, but I think it's important to frame it in terms of the scale of their energy transition strategies, which is still paling compared to some of their renewable power investments that these companies are making.
Okay, very cool, Will. So we always run out of time when we try to have these conversations. We never get to everything we want to talk about. So I know we're running over just a tad, but we'll take one more minute to kind of run around the room and just have folks weigh in on, what's the best way to play hydrogen from an investor perspective right now? And the context that I would note is there are some ETF funds out there. I won't name them. You can look them up on the terminal. They have underperformed the market this last 12 months. Energy stocks in general have done pretty well given the commodity boom that we've seen, and the hydrogen names have struggled. So, where do you go if you think hydrogen's going to be a big deal in the next 10, 20 years? What's the right set of companies to be looking at? So, Salih, we'll come to you first, and then we'll go around.
Because I don't think I'll have too much to say, but within my coverage, which doesn't really include any pure hydrogen plays, which is probably more your question, but within my coverage, I think you would have to be looking at which companies are really just taking energy transition more seriously and have more concrete plans. And within that, I think in Europe, within that mid-sized integrated peer group, I think Repsol has been a pioneer and was the first company to come up with a net zero target. And among other renewable energy power generation targets, they are kind of getting into hydrogen as well. So within my peer group, I would say as a long-term kind of transition and also hydrogen play, that could be an interesting one. And I mean, I know we spoke about Aramco, and it might sound funny to say Aramco is going to be a hydrogen play, and that's not exactly what I'm saying. But I think it's important to remember that they will actually be in a decent position in whatever that hydrogen economy becomes. Because, I mean, when you think about the green hydrogen plants, which are the longer-term plans, I think they have a lot of potential in terms of renewable power generation that they haven't really crystallized on, because, I mean, solar, I think, has a huge potential. Sun is plenty and it's predictable in the region. In terms of blue hydrogen as well, as I mentioned earlier, they have access to natural gas production. They already have some CCUS assets, and they already have some gray hydrogen production. So all in all, I think they will be a big player, even though it's not an exact answer to your question. Like I'm not saying Aramco is a hydrogen play, but just to note that I think there's a good chance that they will eventually be a decent-sized player in the hydrogen economy as well.
Okay, we're gonna go from east to west. So I'm going next. Just quickly from my coverage portfolio, I think a lot of the Repower EU is focused on offshore wind, really being the green electrons to help make the hydrogen that they're set forth in their vision. So you've got Vestas and Siemens Gamesa are potentially exposed to this outcome. We've been making the case that consensus is a bit tepid on how much potential new turbine demand there's going to be in Europe in particular, not just because of the energy crisis, but also because of the energy transition. Nordex does not have an offshore offering, though, so maybe they're a little bit less exposed. So next, we'll go to Patricio Alvarez in London.
Sure. I think, given that I think my whole sector is placed to go hand in hand with green hydrogen, especially because of the intent of growing that renewable power capacity here in Europe. I would base my choice on which companies have the deepest development pipelines for green hydrogen, and that would be RWE, ENGIE, Ørsted, Iberdrola. So all of these are the major. I think these are the companies at the forefront of the energy transition in terms of their renewable capacity growth targets, and I see green hydrogen just being a great sort of accompaniment to that strategy. I think those are a good combination. So yeah, I think in general I think for other companies such as the gas network operators, so your SNAMs, Enagas, Italgas, I think given that those are heavily regulated companies, and green hydrogen is not at a stage where it's being carefully regulated yet. Those companies are companies to look out for in case regulation sort of develops in a favorable way, which seems to be the case now with the Repower EU. But I think my preferred weighting would be on the power generation side.
Okay, Will Hares also in London.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think for my coverage, if you're looking for hydrogen exposure, my coverage list of European majors is probably not the best. But within that, I would say Shell and Equinor, they're the most exposed to some of the largest projects that are under development, and they're leaning green. But if you ask me the question, I'd probably go something like Plug Power. If you really truly believe that hydrogen is going to be a huge component, you want a pure play hydrogen company that is exposed to, building electrolyzers and fuel cells and in these gigafactories they're developing. So pure play, it would be Plug Power, and within my coverage, Shell and Equinor.
All right.
Side.
Thanks, Will. Fernando, you're next as we go across time zones.
For my neck of the woods, as Will said, Exxon and Chevron are the larger players, but they're very diluted in all their other businesses. I think, interestingly, you could potentially play it through a very small cap refiner, CVR Energy. They have an ammonium nitrate subsidiary, CVR Partners, which may gain from adoption of ammonia into hydrogen and that growth. And then, you have other players, especially in the industrial gases side, that we don't cover. Our chemicals colleagues cover, from Linde to Air Products, have a history of producing hydrogen and distributing those gases. And clearly, they have a competitive advantage from having knowledge in that industry for decades.
All right, and we'll let you have the last word, Ish, on kind of where do you place your bets these days?
So I can't go into individual names, so I don't get my hands left from our compliance group. You'd have to pick up the phone and call our research analysts on the public side. But I think, Rob, your kind of framework of thinking about where rents are going to be, and that's kind of driven by supply and demand for things. And I think you kind of picked up on if there's tons of new wind demand that's coming, right? Ultimately, prices are going to go up on that back end, and there's going to be more rents to collect. But I'd encourage anybody who's super interested in the space is map out the value chain, think about what return profiles are going to be in each part of the value chain. The wind and solar guys, we already know it's not we already know what type of expected returns are in those type of names. And then kind of go on down midstream. There's nothing to invest in the public space today, right? Downstream, I think you guys already highlighted the good ones. There's some ammonia exposure and a couple other ways to play it, right? There's the industrial gas guys, I think, are guys to look at if you're interested in seeing how their business models evolve. I think they'll all kind of do nuances. The integrateds, like the Shells, Exxons, et cetera, of the world, I think they're great. But again, how materials, the exposure to hydrogen, that one's tough. And then you've got all the technology, and I'd call them like the broader service providers for both like electrolyzers, all the fuel cells. They're interesting, and they're going to have completely different return profiles, right? But there, it's like you really need to bet on the technologies of who's going to be winners and losers, and not just the ecosystem. I would guess, I haven't looked at constituents in some of the ETFs, but I guess maybe those guys are probably heavily weighted, and a lot of them were maybe more, part of the SPAC tech boom. And so maybe that's also what's caused part of the volatility. Again, haven't looked at the names there. I think maybe the last thing I'd love to say is we're hosting our conference on November 9th and 10th in Houston. Part of our goal is to do the same thing you guys are doing, which is getting the thought leaders in the energy space together. We're having a very exclusive group of 65 to 70. We'd love if we can have somebody from I've been so impressed with you guys and the knowledge you guys here today that I've heard on that. We'd love to have somebody from the Bloomberg team come join us. I think you guys are definitely the thought leaders that are out there. I've been so impressed from this call. So we'll be exclusively focused on hydrogen, and we've got representatives from leading organizations kind of focused across the value chain. And with that, kind of big thank you from me for including me in the conversation today, and we'll see where this goes. Just the last word, remember LNG sounded crazy 15 years ago, and look at where it is today. It's growing, and I think today there's probably unlimited demands from our friends across the pond for the folks sitting in Europe ahead of the winter, right? And it sounded crazy 15 years ago. So who knows where hydrogen's going to take us, but I think it's going to be big and fast.
I love that comparison. Let's see how it plays out. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We get together on the first and third Wednesday of every month, have conversations like this. It was really cool to go deep on hydrogen, and I know I learned a lot as well. So thanks everyone for your time. You can find all of our research on BIGO, and all of our contact info is easily found on Google these days. So give us a shout if you have any follow-up questions. Take care, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.